Welcome to the AirCon Vault. Here you can find the recordings of the live streams from Airwiggle's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors. A sound effect, Aftertouch Audio, Boom Library, Fmod, Game Audio Learning, Game SoundCon, Kilohertz, Rep Rooms, Soundcuts, Strata from Audio Kinetic, and Airwiggles, the online home for audio people. We hope you enjoy the video.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and when you are, as always with AirCon. Alexander Horowitz here, and today's session we're going to talk all about interviews. Now, I'm a big fan of interviews. I like being interviewed. I like giving interviews. But I just want to start this off by saying that I'm expressing my own views here. This isn't necessarily views of companies I've been at before or where I am now at EA, part of Criterion. It's really about my experience of being an interviewee and an interviewer over the years. And we'll have some other insights as well, which I'll show you in a sec. So what can you expect from this session then? Well, what not to expect first is the following. I'm not going to give you specific answers to specific questions. Our range of roles and experience and the companies we're applying for and what we bring to the interview is so wide that it would be impossible to answer specific questions within the context of the interview. I'm also not going to suggest that there are any silver bullets here, anything that is, if you do this one thing, then you will be fine for an interview. It's not necessarily about the single trick or a single tip. It's the amalgamation of all of the different types of ways you can approach being interviewed for a game audio role. And finally, I'm going to try not to say that interviewing is easy. Now, I don't find it easy, but I do find it fun, and there is a difference. Interviewing is challenging. Being interviewed can be a challenge, but I like the idea of it being a fun experience as well. So if you find me drifting towards the idea of easiness, that's why. What I do want to discuss with you are some of the common issues that people experience when they're interviewing, and some of the ways that we can overcome that. I also want to look at some of the practical advice on how to succeed in interviews, and we're going to get direct insights from people who've been in the position of recruiting and doing game audio interviews. Now you ask, how are we going to do that? We're going to do this from hearing directly through videos from the following. So we have Adele Cutting from Soundcuts, Barney Pratt from Supermassive Games, Gav Shepard from Rev Rooms and Gwen Raymond from Rev Rooms as well, and Jim Croft from Dambuster. Just to start off by saying thank you to them for their time for this, and also their studios or themselves for agreeing to be involved. So let's hear directly from them.
My name's Adele Cutting, and I'm the founder director of Soundcuts Limited.
I'm Jim Croft, audio director at Dambuster Studios.
My name's Gwen Raymond. I'm the technical director at Rev Rooms, who are a audio co-development studio based out of Brighton.
My name is Barney Pratt. I am senior audio director at Supermassive Games.
So I'm Gav Shepard. I'm one of the joint CEOs at Rev Rooms in Brighton.
And we'll hear more from the five of them over the course of this session. So let's start off with preparing for an interview then, being prepared and what that entails. I'd like to start off by looking at the information we have before we go into an interview setting, what information we're actually using in order to become prepared for that session. First of all, we have the job description. Now, obviously everyone's seen this when they apply for the position, but how much do we actually read it is a different matter. How much do we go into that job description and look line by line at what the recruiter or the hiring manager is expecting from us in an interview setting? The person spec is there as well. Sometimes that's a separate document. Sometimes they're both in the same document. But this understanding of what do we want the person to have, what qualities do we want them to have in order to succeed in our business? We can look into the details of the studio, that is the history of the studio, the games that they've worked on before, and the idea of the culture around that studio as well. A lot of the time, especially history and games is available, but actually culture, a lot of studios have a page on their website dedicated to what their values are or what they find important in a working environment. The hiring manager, we can do the same thing. So we can look at the history of that person, the games they've worked on, and maybe some of the talks they've given as well. Maybe they've done something at AirCon before. Maybe they've done GDC, Game SoundCon, Develop. We can start to work out what makes them tick. And we're not trying to say the right thing necessarily, but we're trying to present to them the things they might be interested in which will be talking points in interview. And looking at the hiring panel as well. So not just the hiring manager, the audio leader, the head of audio, whoever is posting that role, but looking at the history of the people on the panel, what they've worked on, the games they've worked on before, and if they've done any talks or community outreach pieces as well over the years. Now, in terms of the manager and the hiring panel, if you don't have that information already, you can get that before going in. It's a perfectly valid question to find out who you're meeting, who will be in the room, whether that's a physical room or a virtual space, and then you can find out more about them that way. Let's hear directly from our guests then. And the question here was about what can candidates do to be prepared for going into interview?
They should just do as much research as possible themselves, maybe to the point of collating that research and providing a kind of short presentation.
Research the company that you're interviewing at, find out about their history, understand the games that they make, particularly the last one they made, because that will be fresh in the developers' minds. They'll likely be making a second one or third one.
So definitely I would expect them to, look at our website. I mean, it's pretty much got all the information on it that they would need to know. And from that, there would naturally come out questions about projects, about the type of work we do. So maybe they ask how long projects last, any general information, but I would expect them to know about us. I wouldn't expect them to come in and not know anything about the games we've worked on. That would be a little bit odd.
If they're interviewing for us at RevRooms, then they should do some research on what we do. And that could really be looking for our LinkedIn, or it could be looking at our website, looking at our list of clients, the type of jobs that we do. I'd expect them to know that it's co-dev as opposed to, studio side work, and to understand what that might mean.
If you can't afford to buy the game, at least watch playthroughs, try and understand what the game's all about. And if you can play through it, take notes. I love to hear opinions, and they're great for interview discussion points. What did you like? What would you do differently? Just take some time to work that out beforehand.
There's a piece here about taking notes as well, this idea of you're not doing decades of research into the topic, but starting to really understand what makes the people tick and what the studios have done before. So looking at a checklist of preparedness then, have you really got familiar with the role, what you're expecting on paper, maybe from speaking to people who were already at the studio as well? The job description, the person specification are both there generally in order to help you understand what the studio is looking for. Have you researched the studio extensively? Have you gone into the history of the studio, looked at where they came from, who owns them, what the model is? Maybe looking at some of the titles, things that could have even been cancelled previously, why that's happened. Starting to really understand what the journey that the hiring manager and the panel have likely been on over the years. Looking at history, shipped games, the culture we pointed to before, this idea of understanding studio culture, and looking at maybe some of the current projects, if it's possible to find out what they're working on. Looking at the interview panel as well, so starting to understand who's going to be speaking to you, what makes them tick, and what you can then bring, which showcases your talents in the right light. Maybe looking at some of the interests of that panel, looking at their credits as well. Now, there's an extra bit here where I asked these guests about what they do in order to prepare for an interview. People forget about this. They think about what they need to do as an interviewee, but actually some of the best interviewers will do a lot of preparation beforehand to make sure they're not just coming in there with a CV and a smile.
I will go back through their CV and I'll rewatch their show reel that they've sent.
Before an interview, I do as much preparation as possible. I hate being unprepared. I think it's not only unprofessional, but it's not making the most of that time with a potential candidate.
So I would look through the applicant's CV to start with, the show reel that they sent over, and also look through their LinkedIn.
I'll also prep questions, so things that from reading their CV, questions that I might have that's come out of reading their CV, I'll put those down.
If one of my team knows them, then I'll go and ask them some questions about them.
So I will make sure I have a solid read of their CV, make any notes, write any questions on any holes or any exciting elements that I might find in there, be relevant to the position we're trying to bring them in for.
they'll be interviewing for a role, so there'll be specific details related to that role that I want to find out from them. So I'll have those questions as well written so that I get them all answered. Because what's most frustrating is if somebody leaves the interview and you're like, oh, I didn't ask them about that. So I do like to have some questions so I know I've ticked all the boxes.
It happens all the time as well, that idea of someone's left and you realize there was a thing you were going to bring up near the start of the interview, you never got round to it, and then suddenly you find yourself wanting to find out more later on. And it's the same thing that happens when people leave an interview themselves and they realize they've got questions. And so what I like sometimes is where there's that understanding that if there's anything else you want to know from us, send us a message, and vice versa. Let's have a look then at interview preparation. We'll just summarize this before we move on. So what are interviewers doing? Well, getting familiar with the CV and the show reel. So the idea of not just having a quick read through when we're looking at the long list or the short list phase, but actually getting really familiar with the details of what someone's telling you they're good at and their experience that's on there. And the same with the show reel as well, not just watching it once, saying, yes, that's good, and moving on, but starting to build up a set of notes and discussion topics that we can bring out in interview later. So from an interviewee's perspective, we need to make sure we're really familiar with the CV and the show reel materials as much as somebody who's on the other end would be as well. Familiarity of the role is really important, knowing exactly what we're looking for from an interviewing perspective. Looking at LinkedIn, looking at socials. So a lot of times people who are running interview panels will have a look at candidates online first. I know a lot of recruiters are obviously using LinkedIn religiously these days, but social media to some extent as well, because of this blurring of the lines of personal and professional presence online, seems to come up quite a lot. A lot of interviewers will make extensive notes. I tend to have a few notes in there in terms of questions, but I don't have a big list of questions. But I know that some other interviewers want to have a strict list of questions in order to ensure parity between different candidates. So it really depends on where you're interviewing. Looking at the questions there as well, and making the most of the time, making sure that in that time we have together that we're getting the most out of that experience, rather than we talk about one thing for 40 minutes and we forget to talk about everything else that the candidate is bringing to the table. So let's look at the opening of the interview. And then we'll have a look at what happens beyond that, what that converts to. So when we're going in as a candidate to an interview, how can we avoid being caught off guard by that initial opening? Now, a lot of this comes down to preparation. So anticipating the interest that's going to be related to the role and of the studio. What are the certain things that the role will naturally bring up? If it's within sound design or VO or programming or something else, what are the things that are likely to come up related specifically to that role? And then secondarily, what are the things that the studio or the hiring panel will likely be interested in finding out as well? Preparing for obvious openers. Now, I'm not expecting these to be scripted verbatim, but the idea that we can do preparation for particular openers that will naturally come up in the interview. So one of the questions that usually comes up is, tell me about yourself. But there are also other things like what interests you in the role, why did you apply for the position, what do you know about the games or the studio, and ultimately, and this is one that I use quite a lot actually, what brings us here today? You'll hear Adele talk about this in a second, but I've also used this before where I'll say, we're both sitting here, now we've got a job role we're looking to fill, you're obviously interested in the position, but what's led us up to this point where you're now applying for this position? i.e., why are you not somewhere else? What attracts you to working with us other than it's just necessarily a role that's available out there? Am I suggesting that you practice these word by word? Well, not word for word, but yes, you should practice these openings if they don't come naturally to you. You can practice these out loud by yourself in the mirror to a recording. Before this session, about 4 hours ago, I sat and went through these slides and had to think about some of the things I was going to say to you now. Now, I don't have notes here, I don't have a script, but I do have a familiarity to some extent with some of the things that I'm looking to get across in this session. And interviewing is not really that different when it comes to that initial opening. I think if you've got a good 90-second opener to that question of, tell me about yourself, tell me about your experience, what brings you here, it's usually a really good thing to be able to fall back on, especially if nerves kick in at the start of the interview as well. You can practice this to friends and family. Make sure it's someone who you trust and who can be critical. And those things go hand in hand, really. Can you trust them to tell you truthfully what you're doing well, but being critical about what you're failing in as well? And possibly to a mentor as well. So can you find an industry mentor who can help you with this? I've helped people with interviewing before in this position where they've been looking to get better at their interviewing skills. Things like Limit Break and GameAudioLearning.com on the mentorships page. There are people who are out there in industry looking to partner with people who are looking to either enter industry or step into a new audio role. Let's have a listen to some of our guests here about opening questions. I believe my question for them was, what do you look for in an opening? What do you tend to ask and expect from the opening of an interview?
I like people to start by telling me how they get into sound.
So after I've introduced our team, I normally say, so tell us about yourself. How have you come to be in the position you are today? That's literally what I say.
I like to create as relaxed an atmosphere as possible from the start of the interview. That can change as the interview goes, get more intense in some areas. But I will just start with a little bit of small talk, or maybe speak to them about where they're at currently.
I'm looking at the same time at the chat here, someone saying about that question, tell me about a game that you love the audio for, and then just going completely blank. And that happens naturally. That's the kind of thing where you can be talking for hours in the pub about games that interest you and some of your favorite soundtracks. And then when that becomes an opening question, what brings you here? And tell me about the games that you love. And suddenly people can freeze up because they haven't necessarily spent the time, or just because they get caught off guard because the question's a little bit different to what they're used to. Looking then at the checklist for the opening, have you seriously considered what the panel want from you in that interview? What are the kind of things that would come up? Have you considered what they might ask you? Have you actually really considered of the 5 possible, of the 10 possible openers that you might get there, depending on the role and depending on the studio? Have you prepared responses to common openers? Again, word by word isn't necessarily the best way to do it, because you might recite 90 seconds of your best material at the very start of the interview, but then you can't prepare all the way through. It's almost a choose your own adventure type approach, where eventually you're going to have to think on your feet, and that's part of the game of the interview. That's part of how it works. If needed, you can then practice those openings with friends, family, partners, or a mentor as well. What happens then when you get through the opening, when you're then into the meat of the interview? I've got the quote here. What happens if they keep asking me questions? Panic. Well, actually, no, this is a really good thing, especially if you're finding the questions are coming thick and fast and they're wanting more and more information from you. From my experience, it's because people want to find out more about the candidate. They're excited. They want to make the most of that time because they're onto a good thing here. It's a good thing, but you can't script all of your responses. So making sure that the preparation has been done there. How well do you know the role, the studio, the panel, and ultimately, I don't mean this in a new age way, but how well do you know yourself? How well do you know what you're bringing to the table, your CV, your show reel, the skills that you say you have? How well are you able to then speak about those when somebody says, tell me about X, Y, Z experience on the CV? This is something I'll do a lot. I like seeing someone's CV and they have a skills section. And what I'll tend to do is, usually the skill that I know the most about, I might say to them, what's the most complex thing you've done with that piece of software? Or what's a challenge that you've had applying that skill? Or start to dig into the things that are just on the page. They created the CV, and so I expect them to then know about it and want to talk about those things. Let's have a listen then to some of the common questions that our guests have experienced.
Reason for leaving and where they see themselves in 5 years.
What do you think you're best at? What are you bringing here?
What their favourite game soundtrack is.
What's the worst piece of code you've ever written?
Whether they need a visa, whether they're relocating.
What is it about audio you love?
What don't you like?
How well do you know Wise? How well do you know Unreal? Have you worked in Meta Sounds?
Are you happy being remote?
what strengths they feel they have for the position.
Any experience with, say, Fmod and Unity?
When did you last make a mistake, and what did you do to rectify it?
I'm not going to be testing you. I'm just trying to find out who you are. I'm trying to work out what makes you tick.
I'm looking in the chat here, this idea of once you've got the preparation for one piece of software, so what's the most complex thing you've done in Fmod, and the question here, what would you change and how well would you do that in Wise? I sometimes do that in interview settings where someone will say, I might say, what's the most complex dialogue system you've built? If they're talking about dialogue systems and having experience of that. And they might say, well, I built this system, it did this and this and this. And I'll say, well, how many lines of dialogue did it handle? And they'll say something like 500 or 600 lines. And I might say, how would you change that system if you had to scale that by 100? If it was now 50,000 lines or 60,000 lines? And it's an interesting way to see how people approach expanding out their knowledge and experience from a fixed point. Some of the common questions checklist. Have you considered responses to questions on the role in the studio? These will come up. Your CV, this will come up. And I've been in an interview before. I'm not going to say who was interviewing me. It was a while ago now. And they went through every single item on my CV. They started at the top and they worked all the way down. And I remember in the interview feeling almost a sense of dread, knowing that some bits on the CV I was better prepared to speak to than others. I knew when we got to that particular line or that section that I wouldn't have as much to speak about than at the top of the CV. And that was very telling of my own experience of what I put down on there. So not all things were equal, and I wasn't ready. I hadn't done the preparation to speak to them all to the same level. So experience and shortcomings on the CV, understanding those. Questions about yourself, and it might not be to do with game audio. It might be to do with something else as well, especially if you've put a personal section on a CV. I like a personal section. I like it when it says something like plays hockey or does skydiving or whatever it is, but expect questions, because I usually want to dig into whatever their main hobby is on there and find out more. And I want to find out more. I expect them to be passionate about it and tell me everything there is to know if that's where we're going in the interview. Maybe your favorite games are important. Your favorite OST is likely to come up, or potentially likely to come up. And definitely there's a best example of good sound design. Also be ready for the follow-on questions. So if we're talking about good sound design, what good looks like, I might follow that up with, how would you improve it? Or how would you expand upon it in a different circumstance? So it's not about trying to find out every possible permutation of questions. To someone on the chat before here said, you can't chat GPT your entire life, right? This idea of you can't have a scripted response to everything, but you can inherently or holistically understand what it is you're bringing to the table and thus what you might get back in an interview. Let's flip this round then and look at questions for the interviewer. This is a common section in interviews. I think everyone who's been in an interview will have heard it at some point, which is, do you have any questions for us? Or do you have any questions for me? And it depends on the studio, but the litmus test I always use is, what is it worth you finding out right now? What are the things that you need to find out right now that this is the right forum and the right person to ask that question to? Things like, how do lunch breaks work? I would recommend that's not worth finding out right now. Things like core hours and lunch breaks and all the other ins and outs of a day, potentially, but not right there. You can find that out with HR, with talent acquisition, before you sign a contract if it's really important to you. Looking at things like the pension plan. Now, perks, pension plans, bike to work scheme, cycle to work, buying bikes and all that kind of stuff. It's all really cool, it's all really important, but if you've got an hour or 90 minutes with the audio director or a senior sound designer, someone like that, these probably aren't the questions that make the best use of your time right now. And also this type of thing, if you could turn into any animal. Now, these questions get thrown out in, say, not mock interviews, but the trope of an interview where if you could be an animal, what would you be? Or if you could describe yourself in a single word. I wouldn't recommend using those back on interviewers. It just doesn't give you any useful information. The things I would stick to, what games do you admire? What makes you tick? What do you think good looks like in game audio? can you tell me more about your tools and tech? Again, this shows an interest in what's actually going on at the studio. It might be that you can then speak to certain elements of that. There might be bits of software that you didn't think were important enough to bring up, but actually there might be experiments going on with certain bits of tools and tech which you might be able to contribute to, or you might be interested in contributing to in the future. And finally, culture. How would you describe your culture? This is a question I've used before as a candidate, and it's really telling the response you get, because studios think more or less about culture depending on how important it is to them. But when you point blank say to someone, what's the culture like in your office? It can really make them think about what it is they value as a studio. The question here for the guests was, what are some of the questions you might want to have asked of you or you think are useful? What can you expect there?
Having questions is important, because not everybody does. And I find it a bit odd if you don't have a question for us.
I want candidates to be asking, be giving me a hard time, be asking me what their role is going to look like, what their life is going to look like in the company or the team.
I want to know that they are taking the interview seriously enough so that they've done the research on the company and they ask about what sort of projects have you got coming up.
I think for me is if the questions have followed on from things we've discussed, I know that they've been interested and they're, it's triggered thoughts as we've progressed through the interview. But as long as they have something, I don't think there's a perfect question really.
I'm trying to think if there was a perfect question. There are certainly anti-perfect questions, things that you shouldn't ask, but I think that we don't have enough time to go into all of those. So your questions, think about the idea of having questions is important, as Adele said there. Going in or going into the interview and finishing that interview, not having anything to ask, it suggests that you're not listening or you're not necessarily engaged in the process. Considering how you might further understand the role through questions as well and demonstrate an understanding of the role. And then you're demonstrating that preparation and that attention that's gone on before the interview and throughout the interview. Let's move on to culture, people, culture, and cultural fit, cultural add. Now, the way that I want to try and frame this is looking at what is fixed and what is variable, i.e. what is set in stone when we enter the interview and what can we change either throughout or with preparation beforehand. So the things that are fixed, at least in my opinion, who you are right now as you enter an interview or on the lead up to it, you can't fundamentally change yourself. You can over time, but who you are is who you are in that moment, and what you've achieved is what you've achieved in that moment. I've been interviewed before where the CV that I presented to somebody, they looked at that CV, and this wasn't the only thing they said, but they looked at a particular role and they said, I don't think you've got enough experience in that role. And I said, well, I can't make the years any longer. I can't make that any bigger. That's what we're playing with here. Now, I didn't get that job necessarily. I think it's probably not the best response to said question, but there was this understanding that was missed, which was, I can't change what's on the page. That's fixed. We also can't necessarily change what the studio is. So when we go into an interview, the studio is not going to bend to our whim based on whatever we want. It's that the studio is what it is, and we're there in a sense to fit into and then to add to what they're trying to achieve. Same with who the panel are. We can't change the panelists or the hiring manager, so that becomes another fixed data point. But what we can control is how we show up to that interview. So the energy that we bring to the interview, the type of energy, whether we're highly energetic, whether we're showing interest and compassion and excitement there. The types of stories and anecdotes that we tell. So sometimes things are more or less appropriate. A studio that's got a very casual culture might like the story about when you went on a holiday to Prague with your friends and you took your recorder along and you went out late one night and recorded all these amazing city ambiences. Whereas a more strict studio might want to talk about the process about how you would record something. You don't need to mention the messy night in Prague. You can talk about the recording process and how you made sure that you were achieving the best possible quality there. And the amount of detail we go into as well. I've been in interviews before where people have talked about one thing for far too long. And I will listen to someone talk about audio all day long, but what it does is it minimizes the amount of time we have to talk about other things. So that's the danger. If you talk about recording for 40 minutes, we don't have very long to talk about all the other elements of the role. And recording might not even be a big part of that role either. Now let's hear directly from our guests about culture. And the question here was about how do you measure skill versus culture? How does that assessment take place?
If you and the company are a good fit, then that will kind of come out naturally in an interview.
Culture is something that's really important to me. When I set up Sound Cuts, it was a specific type of vibe I wanted in the company.
So it's almost like a vibe check as much as anything else. It's kind of, do I see you being an easy person to work with?
My best employees have always been people who really care about other people. They also become great managers.
It's a real blend of both, isn't it? You can't have someone that's just great fun to be around, but that can't fulfill the job, client facing or the actual technical or creative skill. But also you can't have someone that's client facing that's going to be a fantastic technically and creatively, but very difficult to work with.
The best hires are a strong balance or kind of well-balanced individuals where their personalities will make them a great team player and part of the team culture that we have here, but also their skill set will bring something great to the team. And I think they're an extreme in either of those cases can be difficult to manage.
I don't know. It's like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. You know what I mean?
I had to leave that in. It's fantastic. Let's recap then. The summary on culture. Fit goes both ways. And people need to realize this when they're going into an interview setting, that it's not just about what you can be and change in order to fit the studio. It's about that studio being right for you as well. Now, it's been mentioned before, this idea that if someone really needs a job somewhere, then it obviously makes sense in order to try and present oneself in the best way possible. But sometimes, or actually most of the time, studios have a wide range of cultures and there may be natural fits there as well. People may naturally be more drawn to one type of studio culture than another. There was this talk of vibes or aura or quintessence, that fifth element, right? That idea of this ineffable, undefinable thing. I don't necessarily think it's undefinable, but I think it's to do with energy and how we bring and show ourselves within the interview. And ultimately about finding balance, balancing the personality and how much personality we bring to an interview based on what we're getting back versus the skills. Now, of course, the skills are incredibly important. And as Gav said there, it's about that mixture. Someone who is wonderful to be around and a great laugh, but can't really do the work, that's not going to be useful. But somebody who's a brilliant technologist or creatively, they're able to produce amazing things, but they're awful to work with, that's not going to work either. So avoiding extremes is really, really important. Let's round things up and looking at nerves. And nerves is a really important thing. I've spoken to a lot of people, all of the guests about this and others who've approached me before looking for advice on interviews. It's a major topic and it keeps coming back time and time again. Now, before we go into this, I just want to emphasize that it may sound like I'm suggesting that you need to just get over your nerves. I'm not, right? I appreciate that it's difficult and that nerves are naturally a factor in any sort of presentation or interview scenario, but there are ways to manage this, and sometimes it's about embodying the nerves and going with it anyway. Let's unpack it. So what is the good news? Well, if you are nervous for going into interview, it means you've made it to the interview. That's fantastic news. That means you can start to do something within that interview setting. And there are so many hurdles you've already jumped through which you don't necessarily realize potentially. So you've already, of course, made the effort to apply. That's been successful. You've then been longlisted, shortlisted. Then you've been selected for interview after having a CV and a showreel review. And then you've actually managed to find a slot that works for everyone for an interview because, of course, developers are really busy. So everyone's managed to find time for the interview to finally come together, for those stars to align. That's some great news already. You've done your preparation. because you've been paying attention for the last 35 minutes and you've done all of these different things, or you've been doing them already. And you've made all of the preparation that you can possibly do going into the interview. The other bit of good news, and I say this as compassionately as possible, you're not going to die. I promise. The worst possible thing that can happen is you don't get the job. That is the worst possible thing. It might be a terrible experience. You might absolutely hate it, even if you're incredibly nervous. But the worst case is that you do not get that job. I'm not aware of any, there's no secret blacklist or anything like that. And if someone was nervous, I really wouldn't hold it against them. Now, I can't speak for all interviewers, but the ones that are worth working for, I would suggest, or I'd like to think that they also have the same belief and that same compassion about people being nervous. What's the bad news then? Well, it might not feel good. This might not be a nice experience for you. And it might be. I'm not trying to say that everyone is nervous, but if you do have trouble with dealing with nerves, it might not feel great. And also, you still want to succeed in the process. You still want to put your best self forward, and you still want to ultimately convert that interview into your position. So what are some of the things that we consider then going into this? The panel actively want to speak to you. So effort has been made to bring you through the process from long listing to short listing to scheduling the interview to the point where you're sitting either virtually or physically with the interview panel. Plenty of interviewers don't have confidence either. I've met a lot of interviewers who get quite scared about going into that setting because what if I don't know what question to ask? Or what if I get distracted and then don't know what they've just said? Or what if I ask the same question twice? Or what if I forget what I was talking about? So it goes both ways. If in doubt, slow down and breathe. Slow it down. Seriously. I've been in interviews before where people have said, can I just have a minute? And I've said, fine. If anything, it chills everything out. It just takes the tension out of the room. Now, I imagine there'd be some interviewers who wouldn't be happy with that. Would you want to work for them? I can't possibly say. But the idea of slowing everything down is a good thing. It's quite nice now, actually, just slowing down the session here. Seriously, slow it all down. Listening to the question is really, really important. People get ahead of themselves. I've done it before as well. I've been interviewed before where the first few words come out of the question and I think, I know what they're going to ask. And I start thinking about all these different things. And then I've stopped listening to the question. And then you end up in a really awkward position where you think you know what they asked, or you have to ask them to repeat it, or you try and guess at it and it's the wrong thing. So slowing everything down, breathing, listening to the question. All things that pragmatically you can do. You can see in the chat here, someone says, don't drink coffee too much. I mean, I try and offer candidates drinks and teas and coffees and whatever it is, just to try and slow things down and break the ice, rather than bringing them into an interview and saying, right, we're doing an hour-long grilling now. It's about trying to say, let's just have a chat. Let's try and relax here. On that point, should people mention that they're nervous? If you're comfortable doing so, as I say, I've had people who've been very nervous and have mentioned it, and it's perfectly fine. I've given people a minute. I've said to people, why don't you take a couple of minutes, go and get a water or a tea or a coffee, come back, we'll resume. Those people have been hired before as well. So those people who were incredibly nervous in interview, that has converted to a position. And they've got that position over candidates who were way more confident than them. I've also had it where people were clearly incredibly nervous and didn't say anything. And that's perfectly fine as well. So I'm not going to hold it against you if you don't want to say anything and just try and power through. Perfectly fine. That's your choice. I'm just there to try and find out who you are. And I'm of the understanding that when we bring you in inevitably to that role, that you're not going to be nervous like that generally, because all of the pressure was on the interview scenario rather than the day-to-day. Let's have a listen then to our guests talking about their thoughts on dealing with nerves.
If you're well prepared and you've turned up a touch early, you can give yourself a bit of time to relax before the interview. So I think being unprepared or rushing in can make it difficult.
I absolutely believe in the fail to prepare to fail type of adage, really is. And it's the most nervous I've ever been in situations is when I'm winging it and I'm not confident about it. There's no reason to be winging it in it unless you're doing 5 interviews in a day and you really are, you've got a day to do an interview for a whole bunch of different positions and you haven't got time to prepare. But I think that's highly unlikely. So
it's kind of impossible to say, oh, just don't get nervous, because everyone gets nervous. I think it's to some degree, important to consider that actually the interviewer might be a little bit nervous.
I really do think if you're the sort of person who gets nervous in interviews, so just think you're having a chat with, people who love and have the same passion that you do for audio. So just to calm yourself down. But I know that's really hard. I know there's some people who just don't like interviews at all. But for me, unfortunately, it is a lot about the chat and the passion. For me, even if you're not a big talker, you can still show passion in other ways. It's the real, passion and drive to make great audio that I want to come across in an interview.
That person isn't malicious, right? They're not out to trick you. And if they are, it's probably not a place you want to work at anyway.
If you can just get under the nerves and find where your passion is, then I think you can then forget you're in an interview and you can be yourself. And I think that is the best thing you can do. I'm
a fairly relaxed sort of person. I would want people to feel at ease during the interview. So I think we can get the best out of the time we spend together.
You've just got to go with it, haven't you, really? It's everybody suffers from them. You've just got to take a deep breath and go for it.
I like that idea of getting under the nerves that Jim says, trying to almost convert that into excitement somehow, change that energy into something else. So recapping on nerves then. Preparation comes up time and time again. It's something I believe in. It's something that the guests are saying there as well. Preparing, looking at the resources, looking at the panel, thinking about possible things that could happen. It's not overthinking it. It's just getting oneself ready for that process. Turning up early is something we haven't really talked about, but whether that's in the physical world, meet space, or whether that's turning up online. I've seen instances before where people arrive flustered a couple of minutes late for an online interview, and it's because they're not used to using Zoom or Teams or Google Meet or whatever the platform is. They're usually on the other one, and so when they opened at 2 minutes to the hour for their interview on Zoom, Zoom starts applying updates. So no fault of their own, they found themselves now late and stressed and on the back foot. So arriving early online, I'd suggest about 15 minutes, and the same in person as well. If you arrive too early in person, you'll be sat there for 45 minutes in the waiting room, and that's going to give you time to start feeling any level of nerves if they're going to come back in as well. That idea that Adele said was about having a chat. You're just having a chat. And again, I say this with the understanding that people can find this incredibly nerve-wracking, but it is a conversation, and a lot of people who struggle with nerves in this setting will happily talk about their passions in other settings, whether it's online or in person. And finally, if all else fails, if you're really struggling and you're just finding the whole thing nerve-wracking, just try and demonstrate passion. Just try and communicate the passion for the thing that brought you there in the first place. And there's a comment in the chat here, this idea of your body physically responds exactly the way, say if you're nervous or excited. So converting nervous energy into excited energy. It's something I try and do, whether it's an interview setting or something like this. I find this exciting, but I used to find it a bit nerve-wracking. And so trying to find that physical response of what my heart rate's up and the idea of I'm a bit more twitchy, well, it's because I'm excited now. Maybe it's the same thing. So let's look then at putting all of this together, drawing the rest of the owl, so to speak. 5 things in the final checklist in conclusion. Preparation is key. What can we do to prepare? Familiarizing ourselves with the role, the studio, and the panel. I must have said this 5 or 6 times over this session because it's so important. Considering openers. So what are some of the common openers that you might receive? And practicing some of those responses. Not word for word, but starting to get an understanding of what you're bringing to the table, who you are, what you've done before, and what makes you tick. Common questions that might come down the line, things to do with the skills in your CV. It could be middleware, it could be engines, it could be programming languages, it could be plugins. having an understanding of what you're presenting through your show reel and your CV. The fourth thing here is on culture. So bringing passion, bringing energy, and being yourself, that generally applies universally to studios, regardless of their type of culture, of what they're looking for in a candidate. If you can show that you're interested and passionate about the work, and you yourself, and that can differ depending on what we're like, of course, but it's going to be much easier for you to have that conversation and to convince them of the value that you'll bring to the studio. And finally, on nerves that we've just talked about. Feel the fear and do it anyway. That's my advice on that. You might feel nervous. You might do all of this preparation. You might prepare all of your openers. You might practice. You might gear yourself up to be energetic and passionate and still be breaking it. And that's okay. That's fine. Feeling the fear and doing it anyway is my advice there. And that brings us towards the end. Now, I need to thank again all of the guests that took part in this. Thank you for all your contributions. It's great to have your voices in here along with mine. I'm only one data point or one interviewer historically, so it's great to have other people there as well. I wish you all the best in all of the interviews coming up or in the future that you're either doing as an interviewer or an interviewee, actually. Thank you very much for attending. I'm now going to move on to questions. So if people have questions, I haven't had the Q&A bit open. Now it is. Oh, look at all of this. There's all sorts of great things here. So what I'm going to do is start from, that was half an hour ago, and just go on to this. So let's have a look. Roman Roman says, is there a ready-made advice on how to find a job through LinkedIn in another country? I have no permission to work in Europe, Canada, USA. It seems they do not, let me just full screen this, consider me because I'm not in the country in which I'd like to work, and now there's nowhere to go there due to the lack of visas and cost of moving. Visas and the permission to live in certain countries is difficult and depends on where you're moving from and moving to. I think in terms of finding, because there's almost two bits in this question, right? There's about finding jobs, and I always used to use DevBrada, if people have seen this before. Perhaps someone could put something in the chat if people know devbrada.com, which aggregated game audio jobs across the world, and it was filterable by country and by type of role. That website seems to come and go somewhat. There's also sorcery.gg. That's another website that has, it's an aggregate of different jobs, but that's not necessarily to do with game audio. It's to do with other roles in games as well. In terms of visas, again, it's not necessarily interview related, but it's something worth considering, maybe looking in more depth at the laws around there and being realistic about where you can move to. So it might be, I've spoken to people before who want to look at entry-level roles in the US when they're based in the UK. And I say to them, do you have the right to work in the US? And they'll say, well, no. I say, well, then it might be very difficult to convince a studio to give you the visa allowances in order to move across to the US. Let's have a look here then. Lewis says, can you tell me about yourself and how you got into sound? I don't know if that's a question directly for me, but it's a good question for opening for candidates. And it comes up time and time again, I think, as we've talked about there. Greg says, has there been any candidate that particularly stuck out in a positive way in your years of interviewing, and why? There have been a number. I think sometimes you can tell from the offset that someone just has great energy and presence in the space. And I don't mean that in terms of their confidence or how assured they are of their work, but something about them, that quintessence, that ineffable thing that's hard to describe about someone, that can be there. And it's lovely to have that proven correct, where someone actually starts to show you who they are and you can then go on that journey with them throughout the interview. That's a really nice thing to see. In terms of some of the things people have said, it's great to watch people think in interviews. I like it when a question, rather than someone instantly saying the first thing they believe to be correct, if I ask a complicated question, them really thinking about it and talking me through their thought process live, that's always really nice to see. Nico says, how do I make sure I don't waste anyone's time when I apply for a role that I may not have all of the requested qualifications for, especially talking years of experience, ship titles, special tools? As politely as possible, it's not your job to manage their time. And what I mean by that is, if you apply, it's on the recruiter or the talent acquisition person to filter those results. So feel free to apply for whatever you like. You might not get those jobs, you might not get a response, but don't worry about wasting someone's time. It's if you're genuinely interested in the position and you're genuinely working towards that, I wouldn't see anything wrong with someone applying for something they don't think they're perfectly qualified for. And you find this depending on the different demographic breakdowns as well. Certain demographics are less likely to apply for certain jobs as well. And you also find in terms of some people are put off rather, applying for jobs when they haven't hit every single criteria on there. So yeah, apply, go for it. Lewis says, do you think it's worth, if asked about your favorite game, favorite sound, etc., picking something a bit more niche than, say, Last of Us, God of War? I imagine a lot of people often default towards those games as they're so popular. It depends. I think there are a few different ways of doing this. One, you go for the popular thing. So you talk about the thing that everyone knows, and you do it well, or you genuinely show the enthusiasm there. The other, you can go for something that's so niche that you know everything about it, but the interviewer probably doesn't. So you're then losing the opportunity to have that connection there. The third option would be to pick something that they've worked on. But what you're then doing is you're opening the door for them to start getting your feedback on that. And if you're ready for that, great. But be aware that if you choose a title that someone's worked on before and say why it's so great, they might turn around and say, how would you improve it? And now you've got to be ready to stand behind the conviction of your opinions on their work. What else do we have here? Andres says, what's your opinion on cover letters? Do you think it's a necessity in audio job applications? And if yes, what can I include in it that I didn't already in my CV or show reel? I always prepare my CV to be as detailed as possible, highlighting favorite projects, what I did in them, challenges, but most application forms make me put a cover letter in to up my chances. And I have a hard time writing one without repeating everything I already said in my CV. I like a cover letter that tries to explain who the person is and why they're applying. So the CV will have their experience, their education, their skills, their contact details, and maybe a little personal section. Their show reel will have their work, where I can listen to something that they've done before. I can maybe watch and listen to previous projects. But the cover letter is an opportunity to say what makes you tick, what makes you stand out. Some people use it if they're moving careers. So some people who were in, I don't know, live sound, who are moving to game sound, or they're moving from a different industry altogether, can contextualize their experience for me in a way that makes sense. Sometimes people have gone through highly academic backgrounds where they've done, undergrads and masters and PhD in various things before having touched industry. And so they can tell me in the cover letter, it might be a single line on the CV that it just says, I did this qualification. But the cover letter can start to break that down in a way that makes it real, essentially. So I would use it for that. But I would never throw away, personally, I would never throw away an application just because it didn't have a cover letter. But that's just my take on that. I can't speak for everyone. From a recruiter point of view, what's your thoughts on a film audio sound designer, on a film audio sound designer / editor, etc., who has a huge experience and very nice show reels, applying for a game audio position? So moving from linear to non-linear sound, essentially. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine as long as you understand the non-linearity of game audio. You understand how your linear experience might map across, and also if you can contextualize it for me. So if you understand where the gaps might be practically, but you can show me the quality of the sound design from the linear work, then it makes it easier to view you in the non-linear context. Marissa says, is it important to send a follow-up / thank you email after an interview? I've heard a couple of hiring managers say it's disrespectful not to send one, and others say that it's unnecessary. This is the problem, isn't it, with hiring managers? We've essentially split the field where we say, if you send one, then that's bad. And if you don't send one, that's also bad. I can't speak for everyone here. If someone didn't send me one, I wouldn't think they were being rude. So if you do the interview, we shake hands, we leave, and then you wait to hear from me, that's perfectly fine. That's how I'd expect it to go. On the flip side, if somebody sent me an email and said, "Thank you for the time at interview. It was great speaking to you about this, this, and this. I'm looking forward to hearing from you." Great, fine. That's also a perfectly valid response. If I received an email every, say, day that said, "Have you made a decision yet?" At that point, that would be too much. So it's again finding that balance. I don't think there is a hard and fast rule for this, unfortunately. I think it depends on the hiring manager, which means there's almost a reading between the lines with it. Yeah, be interesting to try and dig into that in some detail about who was saying it was disrespectful and who was saying it was unnecessary. Anonymous question here: how many pages should be in the CV? One, if you're starting out. A one pager can be quite nice, and it gives enough information without just bloating the document. Two is perfectly fine as well if you've got more to add. Three is probably unnecessary. If you're on 3 pages, there better be a really good reason for it, because what you're starting to do is actually dilute attention across the things that are important. So if you've worked in this and this, and you've got this qualification and these skills, there's a page. Now the second page, you need to justify using it because you're starting to draw attention away from the first page. The third page, I think, is probably too far. But you may find things like academic CVs go on for 12 pages and have every single publication you've worked on and things. There's no need for that. I think keeping it succinct and directing and focusing the attention of the interviewer onto specific bits is a strength. Someone says, I really only had one interview for a game audio position and I was asked to turn the games on and screen share, which I wasn't prepared for. I didn't have it downloaded. Is that a common practice? I had provided gameplay video in demo reel I sent. Well, I think if someone wants you to screen share something and you don't have it downloaded, it's kind of on them for not having prepared you for that in the first place. So from my experience, if you didn't have that installed, or you weren't set up to screen share because you had 50 tabs open everywhere, that's on me for not preparing you. But if I was inviting you to interview and a week before I said, the interview is going to be with these people, we're going to talk about these kinds of things, and we like to spend 20 minutes playing this game on your screen, is that possible? I would have that conversation beforehand rather than trying to spring it on someone in the interview. But I say that as nicely as possible to not throw this interviewer under the bus. Just prepare your interviewees. That's the trick for it. Prepare what you want to see, and then you can get more out of the time together. This might come up later. Could we get a cheat sheet compiling the points from all of these slides? I'll find some way to share this out. The video of this bit right now will go online anyway in time, so you'll be able to access it there. But let me have a think about it and see what I can do. Alex says, I sometimes fall into the trap of being quite chatty and moving away from the question I've been asked. Do you have any advice on keeping yourself on track when answering a question? Or for when you start sharing an anecdote and need to bring it back to the question you've been asked? Hey, it's a really good point, and I do this as well. I do this just in day-to-day life. Sometimes we get so excited and so leaning into the situation that we just get sidetracked and forget about what we're actually there for. I think this is this idea of keeping the question in mind. Sometimes I'll write a couple of notes. So if the question's quite long, what I might do if I'm being interviewed is I will write down the 2 or 3 key points I want to talk about. So it might be, could you tell me an example? Let's say an example of a game that has great sound design. That's a really broad question. There might be a couple of games I want to talk about. So I might write down number 1, number 2, and then I need to be careful to keep bringing it back to those points rather than letting myself talk about every single game that studio has made or every single effect that's in that particular scene. It's about bringing it back to the question. I don't think you can set a stopwatch for it because it would be very easy to say it's 90 seconds. But what if that conversation starts to become more natural? You don't sit with a friend and have a 90-second conversation and then have a response that's 90 seconds long. You just talk about things. So it's about keeping that in mind and being really conscious of what's going on in the interview. Let's have a look. This was an idea of finding balance. So if you're smiling, laughing, and cracking jokes too much, hang on, if I There we go. You're smiling, laughing, and cracking jokes too much, then you're seen as stupid. If you're too serious, you're not good to work with. So how do you find the balance? This came up with guests in the VTs there, but it's about being yourself, right? It's the idea of honestly being yourself and trying to. It's much easier to be who you are. If you're naturally a quite serious person, then feel free to be serious, but demonstrate that passion and that excitement for game audio through that interview as well, and the same vice versa. Someone says, how do you get a job interview? I think we talked about that in terms of the quality of the application. It's probably a topic for a different session, but the quality of the CV and the quality of the show reel, based on previous experience as well, and networking through events, probably outside of the scope of this, but it's definitely a good question, and it's probably something about applications to look at in the future. We talked about following up on interviews. Ian says, do you think having WISE certifications is beneficial? Yes, it can be, but I wouldn't hold it against someone if they didn't have them. And I've been in interviews before where people have said, I'm familiar with the WISE 101 content, but I haven't done the exam because it costs however much it cost. And then I might say a question from the WISE 101 content. And that's the way of verifying that. So I don't need someone to pay for the certifications, but if you want to, it's perfectly valid as well. Lamar says, how long does it take to typically hear back from a studio? Some studios will do it instantly. So some studios might be sat there with you and say, great, you've got the job. Some studios might get back to you at the end of the day. Some studios might take a month. It really depends. And it depends on where other candidates are in the queue as well. So don't be disheartened if you haven't heard back. Let's say it's a Monday and you're interviewed and you haven't heard back by the Friday, because it might be longer. Heli says, what is the weirdest question you've ever been asked in an interview? I think I've blanked them out at this point. I think I try not to ask weird questions, and I think anything that I've been asked before. I did have one studio that said, who is someone that you admire? And I said Tim Peake, the British astronaut. And I'm not sure they were very pleased with that response. I think they were expecting someone in game audio. And I just said, well, he was cool and he was in the army and flew Apache helicopters. So it wasn't what they expected, and yeah, that one didn't work out. Do you think international candidates have the same chances of those who are inland and live in the same country of company? This isn't really an interview question necessarily, but it depends. Some studios want to be able to fill this in-house, and others will struggle with visas as well. We talked about visas earlier. So really this is about whether you're able to work in the country and whether they want someone immediately, boots on the ground, or whether they can wait a while to bring somebody across. Heli says, do you think there's an advantage in going to an interview in person versus online? Personally, I prefer in person, but I'm aware that you can get a wider range of potential candidates online as well. It really just depends. I mean, I wouldn't hold it against anyone, but I would always try and make sure that if you're interviewing for a role, i.e. if you're the hiring panel, that you interview all of the candidates using the same method. So don't have one person come in and the rest of them online. Make sure there's a parity between that. Is there anything that's mandatory for you to see a demo reel? Again, a little bit outside of the interview topic here, but I think if we were asking that question of the guests and myself, it would be a high quality sound design that's really considered and understands what it's trying to achieve for the scene. Tyrrell says, from the job posts I find, most are overseas and offer remote opportunities. Again, this is about relocation. Go for it. I would suggest just go for it. Is it worth applying for the job to try your luck and move on and stay close to home? I wouldn't move country just to get the job, but there's no harm in applying and saying that you're willing to relocate as well. And that can come up in the interview. It might come up beforehand. Jaden says, when doing research on a company, does that start before you put in your application or after you put in your application? Hey, it's a really good question, actually. So if you are applying for a job, think about how long it might take for that to come back round into an interview. So if you've got the time, you could do the research beforehand. You might do the research beforehand to tailor your application to the company. But as soon as you've got the interview invitation, you need to start doing that research straight away. I wouldn't leave it until the day before. I would do as much as you can as soon as possible so it's embedded in there and you're ready to roll. Another question here. How common is it for studios to open a position and interview people when in actuality they've already decided who they're going to hire? I've never experienced it on a hiring panel before, and I think it would be really bad form if that were the case. Ultimately, interviewing people takes time. It takes a lot of time from a lot of people. It's not worth interviewing people if there's no position for them. You're better off just not bothering opening the role up and just giving it to someone internally. It all depends on local labor laws as well. So if you're publicly funded or in certain parts of the world, you have to open up roles publicly. But in other organizations, depending on the structure of that business, that can be an internal hire. Would you consider someone with a very good experience in film audio or any linear audio field? Yeah, we talked about this before, right? So this is the idea of contextualizing your experience in the interview and making it real for the place that you're in. How many more questions we got here? A few more. So Andy says, what's your take on interviewers giving feedback to unsuccessful candidates? It's something I've recently started doing because from past experience, I haven't received it and would have found it useful. I think it can be appropriate. I think it depends on the relationship you've got with that candidate and whether they're interested in finding that out. Sometimes it can be seen as unwarranted advice. But if somebody reached out to me and said, it would be great to get some feedback from you as to why I didn't get the role, where I'm allowed to, in terms of HR and various other company policies, I would very much like to give that feedback. Melly says, is it considered a good quality or potentially rude to be taking notes throughout an interview as the one being interviewed? It depends, right? So if you've got a notepad and you're essentially, looking down occasionally and taking the odd note like this, I think it's perfectly fine. If you spend the entire interview just staring down at your notepad, well, it's going to suggest that you're not interested in the session. And so that's the way that I would see it, is basically the same way you would do on your phone at a bar with a friend. So it's all right to check your phone once in a while, but if you spend the entire night sitting scrolling on the thing, as your friend, I'm probably going to think you're not interested in the quality of the conversation. Tyrrell says, another question on CVs. Should your job history only reflect your audio experience, or are older positions useful, like an old job that has loads of transferable skills or benefits? It depends on how you contextualize the skills of that role. So if you can find a way of making the skills and experience from that role map onto what the studio is looking for, then great. Otherwise, it's going to distract from the experience that you already do have that's more relevant. There's another question here. Do you often or ever see your first choice candidate turn down the job? Do you always have a backup selection? On the first point, yes, it happens. People get roles elsewhere. People tend not to just turn it down. They accept something else because a really good candidate might be interviewing at multiple places. Do you have a backup selection? Sort of. You think about who your favorite and who your second would be. Sometimes you've got two who are neck and neck and you're trying to find a way to resolve that, and then one of them pulls out anyway, and you say, okay, well now our first choice is really easy. Christoph says, do you ever get nasty comments from candidates that aim towards general EA policy? Curious if there are people who want to let it out because they've had a talk to an EA rep. Can't speak about company stuff, but generally people have been really pleasant that I've been interviewing over the years. And finally, would you consider someone with great sound design skills but zero experience in using Wise and Unreal? It depends on how they demonstrate an understanding of what they need to know. So if they come from a linear world, they've got great sound design chops, but they know they're not quite there with the implementation, will that work initially? And how quickly can we get them up to speed? That's the way that I see it. It's a great one to end on, actually. What about the salary expectations question? I'm trying to work out which way this is asking. So when somebody says to you, an interviewer says, what are your salary expectations? I prefer if that question's being discussed with HR or talent acquisition beforehand. I don't personally ask it in the interview because, again, I'm trying to focus on audio related things or things related to the role. If it comes up, I mean, there's always that bit of a game of how high do you anchor it. If you say too high, then it might seem like you're out of the banding for the role. I really prefer if that comes up beforehand, and if you're thinking about that or you think that might come up, it would be worth having that conversation with the talent acquisition person beforehand so that you have realistic expectations on both sides. Wonderful. So many great questions, so many topics to go over there, and food for thought for next time as well. Things about CVs, show reels, all the bits off the back of interviews as well. So really, thank you very much for all of those. We're going to wrap things up now. We've been going for 70 odd minutes or so. So all I want to say is just thank you again to all of the guests that volunteered their time and faces and voices for this session. Thank you to all of you for your questions and attendance and all the rest of it. It's been great to see the chat and to see the questions come in and to have a go at those as well. And again, finally, best of luck with all of your interviews in the future and take care of yourselves. Bye for now.